Hello from the Barista Course Hamburg. Today we want to take a look at the topic of espresso grinders. More specifically, the difference between so-called single-dose grinders and grinders with a storage container, also known as a hopper. And of course, we'll cover the differences between these grinders, their handling, what types of grinders exist in these areas, and which one might be the most suitable for you. But that's not all, of course. We also want to focus on the taste, of course. Specifically, we asked ourselves, does an espresso from a single-dose grinder possibly taste different than one from a grinder with a storage container? And you'll see what we found out in just a moment. Regarding the last question asked, whether espresso from a single-dose grinder tastes different than from one with a hopper, you can probably guess that was a leading question. And you'll see what we found out in just a moment. And if you're interested in these topics in general, if you're interested in machine tests, grinder tests, and tips and tricks all about espresso, then we'd be really happy if you subscribe to our channel, like our video, and join the discussion here. You're also welcome to hype the video. That's possible within the first 7 days, but only with a tablet or a smartphone. This makes our video much more visible, and you support us in our project here on YouTube so that we can continue this in the future. Thanks a lot in advance, but now of course it's all about the espresso grinder. Before we look at the difference in taste, first a brief overview of the grinders and how they work. In the last 10 to 15 years, an incredible amount has happened on the grinder market. In general, a lot has happened in the field of espresso. It has become much more refined. We are much more nuanced today than we might have been 10 years ago. And that's how the grinders have evolved too. 10 to 15 years ago, it was roughly the case that grinders had a kind of storage container. That means we ground the espresso in advance. You can imagine, of course, that the ground espresso in this storage container, especially if it sits there for a while, loses an incredible amount of aroma. People don't really do that at all anymore these days. These grinders have almost disappeared from the market. Freshness when grinding and the storage of the espresso is a very important topic anyway. The fresher you grind and the better you store the espresso, the more aromas you will get out of the espresso. Regarding storage, it's actually quite simple. You should store the espresso in a cool, dry and dark place, definitely not in the refrigerator. For good storage, those storage containers that can be vacuum sealed are particularly suitable. That means you can pull the oxygen out, and thus the espresso can no longer spoil quite as quickly or lose its aromas. At some point, grinders came onto the market with which you then ground the espresso fresh right before extracting. And those were grinders that usually had a hopper. That means you have a certain supply of beans at the top and you always grind them fresh. These grinders are generally also called grind-on-demand grinders. That means we really only grind our espresso beans at the moment we actually want to prepare our espresso. In the beginning, there were mainly manual grinders. That means you didn't know how much espresso grounds you ground out per second. So you had to weigh the espresso grounds afterwards so that you didn't have too much or too little in your basket. At some point, there were grinders with a so-called timer. That means you could program exactly how long the grinder runs and thus roughly determine how many grams you have in the portafilter. But that is very dependent on how fine or coarse your grind setting is. Because, as a rule of thumb, the finer the grind setting is, the less espresso comes out per second into your portafilter. And it's naturally the exact opposite. The coarser you grind, the more you grind per second into your portafilter. And even with these grinders, there are many different versions, meaning you can either grind directly into the portafilter or you have to grind into a small dosing cup. And it's always a question of what you personally prefer. In the last 2 years or so, so-called grind-by-weight grinders have come onto the market. This means the grinders measure the ground coffee exactly at the moment it is being ground. In other words, we no longer need to weigh our coffee grounds, and we no longer have time-based control. This means we might want 9 grams for a single shot or perhaps 18 grams for a double shot in our portafilter. And these grinders generally grind exactly those 9 or 18 grams very precisely into our portafilter. That naturally saves the step of measuring because, as I said, with time-controlled grinders, what goes into our portafilter per second changes depending on the grind setting. That's super practical, especially for people like me who are a bit lazy. Early in the morning, I honestly don't feel like precisely weighing out my coffee grounds as well. But that's a very personal question, and depending on what you enjoy, you simply get the grinder for it. Until now, however, there were very, very few grinders in this design. Currently, there are about 3 to 4 grinders in the home sector that grind our espresso in exactly this way. However, grinder manufacturers have apparently realized that this is a very interesting market and that many, many users want such a function in a grinder. And 2026 will be a very interesting year regarding grind-by-weight grinders. Because several grinders were already announced last year that are supposed to come onto the market in the first or second quarter of 2026. For example, there will be grinders from ECM, from Rocket, from Malkönig, from Eureka, and certainly from several other manufacturers as well. But then, in recent years, there has also been another movement in the grinder sector. Namely, so-called single-dose grinders were developed, and they have enjoyed great popularity. With single-dose grinders, you have to work a bit differently than with grind-on-demand grinders. This means the effort is a bit greater because you weigh your beans in advance, the ones you want to grind. So for a double shot, for example, 18 grams. You then put these 18 grams into the top of the grinder and you grind the 18 grams out as well. Because that's the advantage of single-dose grinders. They avoid the so-called retention. Retention simply means that with almost all grinders, especially those with a so-called hopper, a little freshly ground coffee always gets stuck in the grinding chamber. And these grounds only come out when I start grinding again. And that's naturally a bit of a drawback when I'm trying to find my grind setting, because every time I change the grind size, with a classic grinder, as I said, a bit of coffee ground at the old setting comes out at first. So I always end up with a mix. And ultimately, that means I'm throwing away some coffee grounds every time I adjust my grind setting. And to avoid that, as I mentioned, these single-dose grinders were developed, which try to prevent exactly that. So you put 18 grams in at the top, and usually 18 grams come out at the bottom. They achieve this in various different ways. For example, some grinders have a little knocker to knock the retention space empty. And there are grinders with a so-called bellows on top, which you use to simply blow out the grinding chamber and all the paths inside the grinder, so that you get your 18 grams that you put in at the top back out into your portafilter. Of course, there are different types of grinders here too. For some, you'll need a so-called dosing cup, and with other grinders, you can grind directly into the portafilter. Single-dose grinders have another advantage, of course. You can just easily switch back and forth between your different bean varieties. That means you might have a fruity one in the morning, a classic Italian at noon, and maybe a decaf coffee in the evening. Naturally, you can't do that with classic grind-on-demand grinders, because it's generally far too much effort to remove the bean hopper and then also vacuum or empty out the bean chamber just so you can put in your new coffee. And it's not just easier to switch beans for espresso. If you want to make a regular coffee, a single-dose grinder is simply easier to handle. Of course, there's also a downside to single-dose grinders, and it's a factor that I find particularly annoying. Many single-dose grinders cause a high static charge in the coffee grounds. This means the espresso grounds fly everywhere and stick to the grinder. And in the worst-case scenario, it really sticks to the dosing cup, and you can hardly get your espresso into your portafilter without losing a significant amount of it. And I personally find that very annoying. You can get around it a bit by lightly misting the espresso beans first, shaking them up a little, and only then grinding them. By doing that, the slight moisture, not too much, helps dissipate the static charge of the espresso beans. We'll probably make a separate video about this topic as well. So that's one factor that isn't so great. On the other hand, with grind-on-demand grinders, you have the issue of retention, which can be up to 10 or 12 grams, basically a whole espresso. And that's basically all there is to say about the grinders. So you just have to see what you feel like doing. Do you want to weigh beforehand? Do you want to switch your espresso? Are you too lazy and prefer a GBW grinder, so a grind-by-weight grinder? That's actually up to you. And that would actually be it. At least almost, because we naturally asked ourselves the question, does an espresso from a single-dose grinder taste exactly like an espresso from a grinder with a hopper? And to be able to test that, we went looking for 2 grinders that have as many identical components as possible. Ultimately, we found what we were looking for at Malkönig because they launched the X64 SD grinder last year. And now, very recently, the E64WS grinder will be coming onto the market soon. That's a grind-by-weight grinder with a sync function, but that's not what today is about. Because it's only about whether the taste from these 2 grinders is different. We took these two grinders because, for one thing, they have the same motor installed. And on top of that, it also works at the same number of revolutions. So speed, so we don't have any deviation there. And beyond that, we were able to install the exact same grinding discs in both grinders. That means we already have two components that are very much responsible for how our espresso ultimately tastes. And I would say, before we go into the details, let's first make an espresso that's as exactly the same as possible from both grinders and test it. The exact same beans, that means from the same pack. And in this case, we even took a 100% Robusta so that we don't also have a blend where there might also be differences. So we're taking the same beans, and also during processing, we naturally make sure that we work as precisely as possible. That means we'll use a WDT tool. After that, we'll naturally work with a leveler, and we've picked out a tamper, which works electrically. That means it always reaches exactly the same amount of pressure, because that would also make a difference, of course. And first of all, we naturally have to carefully weigh out our coffee beans for the single dose grinder, so that we naturally have exactly the same number of grams in both of our portafilters. $18.1, but that'll work out. We'll measure it afterwards. We can check that again exactly. We want to have everything exactly the same to the 10th. And now we have exactly 18.0 grams. We'll do the same now, of course, with the other grinder. And since we're grinding directly into the hot portafilter with our GBW grinder, we'll pull that espresso first, so we can extract our other espresso from the single dose grinder as soon as possible after that, because we want them to be quite similar. So as a result, we should work very, very quickly, actually as quickly as possible. Here we go. Now we have two almost exactly identical espressos here, one from the single dose grinder and one from the grind by weight grinder. This one is now 30 seconds older. We wanted to use the same machine, the same basket, the same portafilter, and so on to compare them. So it might be a touch colder. And now let's just taste the difference. Let's start with the espresso from this grinder. Oh, that's delicious. And neutralize a bit. And now let's try the espresso from the single dose grinder. Super delicious, but both actually taste a little bit different. Not just because it was extracted 30 seconds later, but because we found that single dose grinders grind differently than grind on demand grinders. I'll try it again. With the single-dose grinder, different aromas are actually extracted than with the grind-on-demand grinder. From this cup, it's a bit sweeter. It's slightly creamier than from this cup here. In terms of taste, it's obviously hard to judge right now. I can't tell you this one is better or that one is better. That means my taste could be completely different from yours. And that's perfectly normal. I'll try it again. Fantastic. I mean, really fantastic. Significantly more sweetness. Yes, a touch more astringency, but also a little bit of acidity plays more of a role there. But these are nuances. And of course, we asked ourselves what the reason for that is. Because the same grinding burrs are installed, the same motors are in there, it's the same speed, we have the same machine, we have the same recipe, everything is pretty much the same. But before we explain that to you, we're going to do another little experiment. That means we're going to grind another espresso shot using the single-dose grinder in this particular setup. Then we'll place an artificial hopper right on top of the grinder and carefully fill it with approximately 250 grams of whole coffee beans, just as we have done with this storage container. And then we'll just see what the result looks like. As you've seen, we've achieved a completely different result. In the normal single-dose version, we got our normal espresso, and in the version with this hopper, here we suddenly got a ristretto, not even a ristretto out of it. That means we've more than halved the result in the cup. This means that if we put a hopper on and thus put weight on the grinding burrs and on the beans underneath, the grind size changes completely, even though we haven't adjusted it. And that is super exciting. And of course, that changes the flavors in the cup. We saw that earlier. We brewed the exact same recipe between a single-dose grinder and a standard grind-by-weight grinder and got a different taste in the cup. And to verify the results even more precisely, we ran the same test again with our GBW grinder, because this one has a micrometer precise grind setting, and we could really check exactly at which grind setting we achieved the same ratio between in and out. And we found that with an empty hopper, like a single-dose setup, we had to set the grind significantly finer than with a full hopper. And we wanted to share that with you because it's really an interesting story. And what did we achieve by doing that? It means the standard single-dose version grinds much finer. This naturally results in a different particle distribution that quite simply changes the taste. So if I want to try to get as similar a taste in the cup as possible with these two grinders, I have to adjust the grind setting on either this grinder or that one, depending on what I want, just a little bit. And that's because I want to change the extraction time slightly. And that's it for today. We hope you enjoyed our little experiment. We'd love a thumbs up from you. We're happy about every new subscriber to our channel. And of course, we also sincerely hope that we might perhaps have been able to help you make a decision between a single-dose grinder and a grind-on-demand grinder. If you want to see more, as I said, hit the bell icon, then you'll know when the next video is out. Thanks for watching, and until next time, enjoy a delicious coffee.